Valeborn glittered every spring, not because it was warm, but because it demanded to be admired. Chandeliers burned like captured stars above marble floors. Silk skirts whispered secrets against polished stone, and every smile carried a calculation beneath its powder. In that city, a woman was measured long before she ever spoke, by the line of her waist, the quietness of her laughter, and how well she knew when to disappear. Lady Maris Ellington had learned all of that by the age of 16. At 24, she moved through the great houses of Valeborn with practiced restraint, aware of how eyes lingered a fraction longer on her than on other women, not with desire but with judgment. She was not clumsy nor careless. Her posture was straight, her gowns chosen with precision, her hair always arranged to soften what society considered excess. Yet none of it was enough. Maris was described as substantial, a word spoken with polite smiles and sharpened edges. Too tall, too solid, too present. Worse still, she asked questions. She remembered numbers. She read ledgers the way other young ladies read love poems. And in Valeborn, a woman who took up space in both body and mind was considered a problem waiting to happen. That evening, the Winthrop ballroom shimmered with expectation. It was the sort of gathering where futures were quietly decided, who would marry well, who would fade into harmless obscurity, and who would be pitied behind gloved hands. Maris stood near a column of pale stone, her back straight, her expression composed, listening more than speaking. She knew how to do that. Listening had always been safer. Across the room, laughter rippled like a controlled fire. Men gathered in confident clusters, women in careful arcs. Maris recognized familiar faces, families who nodded to her mother with approval, then turned away from Maris herself with something that looked almost like relief, as if her existence reassured them that no matter how uncertain their own prospects were, at least they were not her. She told herself she did not care. Yet when her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, she knew that was not entirely true. Mr. Dorian Hale had once stood exactly where he now lingered, close enough that she could hear his voice even over the orchestra. Months earlier, he had spoken to her with a softness that suggested interest, had complimented her wit, had asked her opinions on trade routes and tariffs as though they mattered. Maris had allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that perhaps she had misjudged the limits placed upon her. Tonight, he did not look at her. She excused herself quietly, stepping away from the edge of the room. The air near the terrace doors was cooler, less perfumed. She welcomed it. Welcomed the way the music dulled slightly as she moved toward the shadowed corridor that led outside. It was there, half hidden by velvet drapery, that she heard his voice again. She had not intended to listen. She had only paused to steady herself. But laughter burst too close, and the words followed before she could retreat. "I never meant it seriously," Dorian was saying, his tone light, indulgent. "She's clever, I'll give her that, but really, have you seen her properly? I need a wife who fits the role, not a walking account book in too much fabric." Another man chuckled. "Ellington's daughter? Ambitious choice, if you enjoy effort." "Effort is precisely the problem," Dorian replied. "I require elegance, not presence. Besides, such women expect far too much. Minds like that forget their place." The laughter that followed was brief, but complete, satisfied. Maris did not move. The words did not strike like thunder. They sank slowly, deeply, each one finding its mark with cruel accuracy. She had heard variations of them all her life, wrapped in courtesy, disguised as concern. This time there was no disguise at all. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass of the terrace doors, her own face pale, eyes bright with something that was not quite tears. For a moment, she considered turning away, pretending she had heard nothing, folding herself smaller as she always had. Instead, she remained where she was. She listened until the conversation drifted elsewhere, until the sound of it lost meaning. Only then did she step outside into the night air, the coolness pressing against her skin like a necessary truth. Valeborn stretched beyond the terrace, lights flickering like distant promises she had never been meant to claim. Maris rested her hands on the stone balustrade and breathed, slowly, deliberately. She understood something then, not all at once, but clearly enough to change her forever. It was not that she was unworthy of being chosen. It was that she had been asking to be. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring the next part of Maris's journey to life. Maris did not return to the ballroom. The night air steadied her as nothing else could. It stripped away the music, the polite lies, the practiced smiles, leaving only the truth she could no longer avoid. By the time she re-entered the house through a side corridor, her face was composed again, not because the wound had closed, but because she had learned how to carry pain without letting it spill. She left Winthrop House early, offering excuses no one questioned closely. In Valeborn, a woman's quiet departure was rarely noticed, and when it was quickly forgotten. The carriage ride home passed in silence. The streets glided by, lamplit and indifferent. Maris watched the city as though seeing it from a distance for the first time, noting how little it cared whether she belonged to it or not. When the Ellington townhouse finally came into view, she felt neither relief nor dread, only a calm, unsettling clarity. In her bedchamber, she dismissed her maid with a nod. The door closed. The quiet settled. Maris crossed the room and stood before the tall mirror set into the wall, the one she had avoided looking at too directly for years. The candlelight softened nothing now. It revealed exactly what the world always saw, and what it had taught her to apologize for. She reached behind her back and loosened the fastenings of her gown. The fabric slackened, releasing the careful restraint she had worn all evening. One pin came free, then another. Pearls were set aside, gloves laid flat. Each small motion felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. When the corset was finally unfastened, she inhaled fully, as though she had been holding her breath for far longer than a single night. She studied her reflection, not critically, not kindly, but honestly. This was the body that had carried her through ledgers and lessons, through whispered mockery and polite exclusion. This was the mind that remembered figures others forgot, that understood systems where others saw only surfaces. None of it had ever been a mistake, and yet she had spent years treating it as one. She turned away from the mirror and opened the drawer beneath her writing desk. Inside lay neatly arranged papers, household accounts, correspondence, notes she had once kept for her father when illness made numbers blur. She took them out and spread them across the desk, her fingers familiar with the texture of ink and parchment. This, at least, had never betrayed her. Maris sat straight-backed and let the evening replay, not the laughter, but the certainty in Dorian Hale's voice. He had spoken as a man secure in the knowledge that the world would agree with him. That was what stung most. Not his cruelty, but its confidence. She had tried to make herself agreeable, smaller, easier. She had learned when to laugh softly, when to feign ignorance, when to step aside so that others might feel larger in her presence. And still she had been weighed and found wanting. A realization settled with quiet finality. There was no version of herself that Valeborn would ever find acceptable without condition. Maris closed the drawer and rested her hands on the desk, palms down. If the city required her to disappear in order to belong, then she would no longer seek its approval. She would not bargain with her own worth. She would not reshape herself to fit a measure designed to exclude her. What she did not yet know was how that resolve would take form, only that it would. A soft knock sounded at the door. She looked up, startled, and rose. When she opened it, she found not a servant, but her mother's companion, pale and uncertain. "There is a gentleman below," the woman said. "He insists the matter is urgent." Maris hesitated. At that hour, urgency rarely brought anything she wished to entertain. Still, curiosity, dangerous as it was, tugged at her. She descended to the small receiving room at the front of the house, candle in hand. A tall figure stood with his back to the fire, dark against the glow. He turned as she entered. His movements precise, unhurried. She recognized him at once. Duke Cassian Varick of Ashfell did not frequent Valeborn's social gatherings. When he appeared at all, it was briefly, formally, and with purpose. He was spoken of with a mixture of respect and unease, an austere northern duke whose estates were said to be as unyielding as the man himself. He inclined his head. "Lady Maris." There was no appraisal in his gaze, no curiosity masked as charm. He looked at her as one might look at a locked door, assessing, not judging. "I apologize for the hour," he continued, "but my time in the city is limited, and what I have to propose requires clarity rather than ceremony." Maris did not invite him to sit. She remained standing, her posture steady. Then you should speak. Cassian's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Very well. He told her of Ashfell, of northern lands that demanded order, of a household that required a lady capable of more than ornament. He spoke of obligations, of scrutiny, of a child whose existence invited rumor and danger. He did not soften the truth, nor did he embellish it. I am seeking a wife, he said plainly. Not for affection, but for alliance. I require intelligence, discretion, and resolve. In return, I offer protection, authority within my household, and a name no one will dare dismiss. The words hung between them, stark and improbable. Maris felt the echo of Dorian Hale's laughter fade, replaced by something colder, steadier. This was not rescue. It was an exchange. She met Cassian's gaze, her heart steady despite the weight of what he was offering. For the first time that night, she did not feel measured. I will consider it, she said. Cassian inclined his head again. That is all I ask. When he departed, the room seemed altered by his absence. Maris remained where she was, candlelight flickering across her hands. She did not yet know whether she would accept, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never again beg to be chosen. Sleep did not come to Maris easily after the Duke's visit. The house had fallen quiet, yet her thoughts moved with a strange, wakeful discipline, as though they had found a new rhythm and refused to return to the old one. She sat at her desk long after the last candle should have been extinguished, watching the flame shorten as if time itself were being negotiated. Cassian Varrick's proposal had been delivered without romance, without pretended sweetness, and that was precisely what made it difficult to dismiss. It was not a fantasy offered to a desperate woman. It was a transaction presented to someone he believed capable of meeting its terms. Maris had never been spoken to like that by a man in Valeborn. She opened a blank sheet of paper and, instead of writing a diary entry as she once might have, she drew a line down the center. On one side she wrote what acceptance would cost her, on the other, what it might grant. It felt absurdly practical, yet she could not bring herself to stop. Cost, leaving everything familiar, even the few comforts she did possess. Entering a household she did not know, ruled by a man whose reputation was carved from winter and silence. Becoming a wife in name to someone who had not offered affection and had not promised to learn it. Grant. Freedom from being paraded as a cautionary tale. A title that would not be questioned. A life where her mind could be used openly instead of hidden like an embarrassment. A chance to build something that belonged to her, rather than constantly adjusting herself to fit rooms that never wanted her in them. She stared at the words until they blurred. Then she rose and went to the mirror again, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. Candlelight trembled across her reflection. The girl she had once been would have scanned herself for faults, cataloging them like debts. Tonight she looked for something else. She saw shoulders that had remained unbowed through years of small humiliations, hands that had steadied other people's disorder, a face that had learned composure when kindness was rare. She saw endurance and she saw restraint, and she understood how close those things had brought her to vanishing. A faint sound came from the corridor, perhaps a servant turning in sleep, perhaps the settling of wood in the walls. It reminded her that even in her own home she lived under a quiet expectation. Behave, soften, become less noticeable, and perhaps the world would stop pressing on you. Maris set the candle down and exhaled slowly, letting the breath fill her lungs with unforced ease. She had mistaken survival for living. The shame that Dorian Hale had tried to return to her did not feel like a bruise anymore. It felt like a door that had finally closed. In the morning she took breakfast alone because she preferred it that way, and because her mother's habits were predictable. Late tea, a few remarks about appearances, then the daily calculation of what might please the city. Maris listened, sipped, and allowed her mother's chatter to pass like weather. Only when her mother mentioned, with a lightness meant to sound harmless, that Mrs. Winthrop had asked after Maris's sudden indisposition, did Maris set down her cup. "Mother," she said, her tone calm, "did you know that Mr. Hale has been courting Miss Leora Ashford?" Her mother blinked, surprised by the directness. "I had heard a suggestion. Leora is a very pretty girl." "Yes," Maris replied, "and he will marry her because she is easy to display." The words were not bitter, they were simply accurate, and that accuracy made her mother uncomfortable. "Maris," her mother began carefully, I'm sure he did not mean— He meant what he said, Maris interrupted, still without raising her voice. And I am finished letting men like him decide what I am worth. For a moment the dining room felt too quiet, as if the furniture itself were listening. Her mother's gaze moved over Maris the way it always had, searching for what might be corrected. You are emotional, she said at last, as though that explained everything. If you would only apply yourself— Maris stood. I have applied myself for years, she answered, each word precise. To shrinking, to smoothing, to making my thoughts harmless, and my body invisible. It has not earned me respect. It has only trained the world to demand more of my silence. Her mother's mouth tightened. What are you saying? Maris did not dramatize it. She did not pace or plead. She simply spoke the truth as she now understood it. I am saying that I will no longer ask permission to exist in the shape I am, she said. Nor will I accept affection offered in exchange for self-erasure. She left the room, her step steady on the carpeted stairs, her pulse controlled but insistent. Upstairs, she closed the door of her bedchamber and crossed to the desk where her list still lay. There was one more column she had not written yet, the cost of refusing. Refusal meant returning to the same social circuit where pity and mockery swapped masks freely. It meant hearing her name paired with terms like unfortunate, clever but difficult, too much of everything. It meant watching other women marry into safety while she was advised to be grateful for crumbs. It also meant waiting, in some vague hope, for the world to change its mind. Maris knew better than to rely on that. She took out her writing case and composed a short letter to Cassian Varick. The language was formal, her hand controlled. She did not speak of feelings. She spoke of terms. She wrote that she understood his request and wished to discuss the boundaries of authority within his household. She asked what responsibilities he intended to grant, what discretion she would have, what protection he expected her to offer the child whose existence he guarded. It was not the letter of a woman dazzled by a title. It was the letter of someone entering an agreement with eyes open. When she sealed it, she did not feel triumph. She felt something rarer, quiet alignment, as though she had stopped pulling against her own nature and decided, finally, to move with it. Later that afternoon, she did what she had avoided for months. She went to her father's study. The room still carried the faint scent of old ink and leather bindings, the kind of smell that made Maris's mind settle. Her father, Lord Ellington, had not been ill enough to be bedridden, but his strength had diminished. He sat near the window with a blanket over his knees, reading a ledger he no longer truly needed to read. He looked up as she entered. Maris, she approached and kissed his forehead, then sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. For a moment she simply watched the pale winter light move across the page. Father, she began, a proposal has been made. His brows lifted slightly. From whom? Duke Cassian Varick of Ashfell. Her father did not react with the delighted shock her mother would have displayed. He only studied her face as if searching for the reasoning behind the name. And what does the Duke want? He asked. Maris appreciated the question. It assumed that her consent mattered. He wants a duchess who can manage a northern household, she said. He wants a partner in governance and a shield against rumor. He does not pretend to want romance. He wants capability. Her father's gaze sharpened, not unkindly. And what do you want? The simplicity of it nearly undid her. Maris looked down at her hands, at the strength in her fingers, at the steadiness she had cultivated through necessity. Then she lifted her eyes again. I want to live without apology, she said. I want a life where my mind is not treated as a threat, and my body is not treated as a punishment. I want to choose my own usefulness, not have it assigned to me as an insult. Lord Ellington's expression softened. Your mother will oppose it. I know, Maris replied. And you, her father said gently. Are you afraid? Maris considered the question honestly. Yes, she admitted. But I am more afraid of staying here and becoming a lesson people tell their daughters about what happens when a woman is too much. Her father's eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded, once as though something had been resolved. Then you have my blessing, he said quietly. Not because he is a duke, Maris. Because you are choosing. For yourself. The words settled in her chest with a weight that was not painful. It was anchoring. That evening, when her mother learned of the letter, the argument arrived exactly as Maris had expected. Sharp, incredulous, draped in the language of concern. "A man like that will freeze you," her mother warned, pacing the sitting room as if she could wear the decision down through motion. "He is not one of us. The North is brutal. People do not forgive a difference there." Maris remained seated, her posture composed. "Difference is never forgiven here either," she said. "It is not the same," her mother insisted. "Valborn has standards, politeness, rules. You understand the rules." "I understand them," Maris replied. "That is why I am leaving." Her mother halted, staring at her as if she were meeting her daughter for the first time. "You would bind yourself to a man who does not love you?" Maris did not flinch. "I would bind myself to a life that does not require me to despise myself." A silence followed, heavy with everything her mother could not say without admitting what she had always believed. Maris stood, smoothing her skirt with a measured hand. "I am not doing this to punish you," she said. "I am doing it because I refuse to spend the rest of my days auditioning for approval." Her mother's voice tightened. "And if you regret it?" Maris met her gaze without hostility. "Then the regret will be mine," she answered, "which is still better than living a life made of other people's expectations." When Maris returned to her room, the decision felt complete in a way it had not that morning. Not because the path ahead had become easier, but because she had stopped negotiating with fear. She went to bed early, not to escape, but because she knew she would need strength for what came next. In the dark, she imagined the North not as punishment, but as distance, space enough to rebuild herself without constant interruption. She imagined a household that required her mind. She imagined a child caught in cruel rumor, and the strange steadiness she had felt when Cassian mentioned protection as though it were a duty rather than a sentimental impulse. Before sleep finally took her, one last thought came, clear and unembellished. If the world insisted on calling her too much, she would become too much to ignore. Cassian Varick returned to the Ellington townhouse 3 days later, precisely at the hour his letter had promised. Maris knew the moment his carriage stopped outside. There was a particular stillness that followed his arrival, as though the house itself had adjusted to accommodate a presence that did not tolerate delay or excess. She descended the stairs without haste, her thoughts ordered, her resolve intact. This time they met in the larger receiving room, where daylight cut cleanly through tall windows and revealed nothing that could be hidden by shadow. Cassian stood near the hearth, gloved hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered, his expression unchanged but his attention immediate. "Lady Maris," he said, "you asked for clarity. I respect that." She inclined her head. "I asked for honesty. You will have it." They sat opposite one another, the space between them measured, intentional. No tea was poured, no pleasantries exchanged. Cassian wasted nothing on ritual when purpose would do. "I will begin plainly," he said. "Ashfell is not Valborn. My lands are extensive, my household large, and my people practical. I require a duchess who can manage more than appearances. You would hold authority over domestic accounts, provisioning, and internal governance. Your decisions would not be ceremonial, they would matter." Maris listened, not interrupting, noting the absence of flattery. It was not persuasion he offered, but responsibility. "There is also the matter of the child," Cassian continued. "Rowan resides at Greywatch under my protection. Rumors regarding his birth have made him vulnerable. I intend to put an end to that vulnerability." Maris lifted her gaze. "By marriage?" "Yes," he said. "A duchess provides legitimacy to the household, stability, silence." "Silence can be a weapon," Maris replied, "but it can also be a wound." Cassian's eyes sharpened, not defensively but with interest. "You believe the child should be hidden?" "No," Maris said calmly. "I believe he should be protected without being erased. If I am to enter your household, I will not preside over fear disguised as order." For the first time, Cassian did not respond immediately. He studied her as though recalibrating a structure he had thought complete. "Rowan is 7, Maris continued, "old enough to understand rejection, young enough to believe it is his fault. If I am to stand beside him, it will be openly and with purpose. Cassian exhaled slowly. You ask much. I ask what is necessary, she replied. Protection without dignity teaches a child that safety is conditional. The silence that followed was not tense. It was deliberate. At Ashfell, Cassian said at last, I rule by order, because disorder invites attack. But I do not wish to raise a frightened heir to my household. Very well. You will have discretion in how the child is integrated, publicly and privately. Maris nodded once. Then we understand each other. She shifted slightly in her chair, placing her hands on the armrests, grounding herself. There are other terms. Cassian inclined his head. Name them. I will not be expected to perform ignorance, she said. If I advise on matters beyond the household, trade, land management, negotiation, I will be heard. Even if you choose otherwise, I will not be paraded and dismissed. You will be heard, Cassian replied. I have no use for a duchess who cannot think. And in Valborn, Maris added, your protection will be absolute. I will not tolerate public correction, ridicule disguised as humor, or negotiations conducted over my silence. Cassian's mouth curved faintly. Anyone who attempts such behavior will be corrected swiftly. That is not the same thing, Maris said. Correction implies defense. I require partnership. His gaze held hers, assessing without intrusion. Then understand this, he said, and I will not soften myself for society. I will not charm or reassure. If you stand with me, you will stand with my reputation as it is. Maris considered that. A man feared was often respected. A man feared and just was rare. I do not need softness, she said. I need consistency. Cassian stood, signaling the conversation's nearing end. You will have it. He reached into his coat and produced a document, placing it on the table between them. A preliminary contract, not binding. Read it, amend it. When you are satisfied, we will proceed. Maris did not reach for it at once. She looked at him instead. Why me? The question was not insecurity. It was precision. Cassian met it without hesitation. Because you did not ask me what I could give you, he said. You asked what you would be allowed to do. Something settled between them then. Not warmth, but alignment. I will read it, Maris said. Cassian inclined his head. I will return tomorrow. After he left, Maris remained seated, the document untouched for several moments. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of the table, not diminished, not apologetic. When she finally picked up the contract, she read it slowly, line by line, marking margins with deliberate notes. She crossed out assumptions. She clarified authority. She added language about Rowan's education, visibility, and guardianship. This was not surrender, it was construction. That evening she informed her mother of the outcome. The protest was quieter this time, edged with resignation rather than outrage. Maris listened without interruption, then retired early, contract folded neatly beside her. She slept more soundly than she had in months. The following day, when Cassian returned, Maris handed him the revised pages without ceremony. He scanned them once, then again, his expression unreadable. These amendments are substantial, he said. So am I, Maris replied. Cassian looked up, something like approval flickering briefly across his features. Then we are agreed. The engagement was announced before Valborn had time to invent alternatives. Reactions came swiftly. Astonishment, envy, disbelief. But none of it reached Maris in the same way it once might have. She observed it all with a distance earned, not feigned. When the date of the wedding was set, she did not feel fear. She felt readiness. The wedding took place beneath clear skies that offered neither warmth nor threat, only indifference. Valborn gathered as it always did when something unusual occurred, with curiosity carefully masked as courtesy. The cathedral doors opened, and Lady Maris Ellington walked forward without hesitation, her steps unhurried, her expression composed. She did not glow with romantic anticipation, nor did she shrink beneath the weight of attention. She moved as a woman stepping into a role she had examined and chosen. Duke Cassian Varick waited at the altar, tall and unmoving, his presence unmistakable. He did not smile when she approached. He did not reach for her hand until the moment demanded it. When he did, his grip was firm, steady, devoid of performance. The vows were spoken plainly. No promises of passion. No illusions offered for comfort. What passed between them was restraint and intent, witnessed by a city eager to interpret more than it was given. Maris felt the murmurs ripple outward as they turned together, newly bound. Some voices carried disbelief, others thinly veiled resentment. A few held admiration sharpened by envy. She absorbed none of it deeply. Valborn's judgment no longer felt personal, it felt procedural. At the modest reception that followed, Maris stood beside her husband and received congratulations that sounded rehearsed. Dorian Hale was present, she noticed, his expression tightened by something close to confusion. He bowed to her with exaggerated politeness, his eyes skimming her figure as though searching for the flaw that had once amused him. Maris returned the gesture with perfect civility and nothing more. She did not need his recognition. She had already left his measure behind. Cassian spoke little, but when he did, conversations ended. There was no cruelty in it, only certainty. People adjusted themselves accordingly. Maris observed the dynamic with interest, noting how quickly respect followed inevitability. By evening, it was over. There was no lingering celebration, no demand that they remain for show. Cassian preferred departure to display. Before the city could decide what story to tell about them, they were already leaving it behind. The carriage rolled through Valborn's gates just as the lamps were being lit, their glow fading behind layers of stone and distance. Maris watched the familiar streets recede, surprised by the absence of regret. She had imagined this moment many times, expecting a surge of loss. Instead, she felt a quiet release. Cassian sat opposite her, his posture unchanged, his gaze directed toward the passing landscape. "You are leaving without sentiment," he observed. "I am leaving without illusion," Maris replied. He inclined his head slightly. "That will serve you well." The journey north unfolded over days, the terrain shifting gradually from cultivated order to open stretches of land shaped by weather rather than design. Villages thinned, roads narrowed, the air sharpened. They spoke occasionally, about schedules, about the household awaiting them, about practical arrangements that would soon become Maris's responsibility. Cassian did not instruct. He informed. It was a subtle distinction, but she noticed it. At night, when they lodged at inns along the route, they occupied separate rooms without discussion. There was no awkwardness in it, only an understanding that intimacy was not yet required of them. Maris appreciated the absence of expectation. It gave her space to think, to observe, to prepare. On the fourth morning, the land rose around them, rugged and unapologetic. Greywatch appeared in the distance as a structure grown from stone rather than built, a fortress that did not invite admiration, only acknowledgement. "This is Ashfell," Cassian said simply. Maris felt no fear, only alertness. As the carriage approached the gates, she straightened, not out of nerves but intent. This place would not bend easily. Neither would she. The gates opened. Greywatch did not greet newcomers. Its stone walls rose without ornament, darkened by years of wind and frost. Its towers set not for beauty, but for vigilance. The courtyard lay broad and bare, swept clean of anything unnecessary. Servants moved with purpose, their steps efficient, their expressions reserved. Nothing here invited softness, and nothing apologized for it. Maris took it in silently as the carriage came to a halt. Cassian descended first, issuing brief instructions that were followed at once. When he turned back to her, he offered his hand, not ceremonially, but as a practical courtesy over uneven ground. Maris accepted, feeling the solidity beneath her boots as she stepped down. Inside, the great hall echoed faintly, its ceiling high, its banners muted in color. There was warmth from the hearths, but it was the warmth of function, not comfort. This was a place designed to endure. A woman approached them, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, her posture respectful but unbending. "My lord," she said, then turned to Maris. "My lady, I am Mistress Halden. The household is prepared." Maris inclined her head. "Thank you." There was no hesitation in the woman's gaze, only assessment. Maris recognized it instantly. Greywatch, like Valborn, measured those who entered. The difference was that here usefulness mattered more than appearance. Cassian gestured toward the stairs. "Your rooms are prepared in the east wing. You may wish to settle before supper." I would prefer to see the household first, Maris replied. Cassian studied her briefly, then nodded. As you wish. They moved through the corridors at a measured pace. Maris asked questions, not many, but pointed ones, about storage, about supply rotations, about how winter shortages were managed. Mistress Halden answered carefully at first, then with increasing detail as she realized the questions were not decorative. At the end of the corridor, near a narrow set of windows, Cassian stopped. There is someone you should meet, he said. Maris felt the shift immediately, not tension, but caution. A small figure stood near the window, back turned, intent on something beyond the glass. The child's posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind him, in unconscious imitation of the adults around him. He did not turn when they approached. "This is Rowan," Cassian said, his voice even. "Rowan, my wife." The boy turned slowly. He was slight for his age, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his expression carefully blank. He did not bow. He did not smile. His gaze flicked briefly to Cassian, then back to Maris, wary and appraising. Maris did not move toward him. She knelt instead, lowering herself until they were nearly eye level, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Hello, Rowan," she said. "I'm Maris." The boy's eyes narrowed a fraction. "You're the Duchess." "Yes," she said simply. "And you live here." A pause followed. Rowan glanced again at Cassian, as if seeking instruction. Cassian said nothing. "I know this place is full of rules," Maris continued, her tone calm. "And I know rules can make it hard to decide what you're allowed to say. So you don't have to say anything at all." Rowan's shoulders loosened, just slightly. "You like maps," Maris added, not as a question. Rowan's eyes sharpened. "Who told you?" "No one," she replied. "But you were looking north, not down. People who like maps usually do that." Another pause, then cautiously, "I like stars better." Maris nodded. "Stars are harder to lose." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, then quick retreat. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into the small satchel she carried. She did not offer it immediately, only held it where he could see. "It's not a gift you have to accept. You can look at it first." Rowan hesitated, then stepped closer. Inside the satchel lay a folded chart, its edges worn, but cared for. Maris unfolded it just enough to reveal constellations marked in careful ink. Rowan's breath caught before he could stop it. "It belonged to my father," Maris said quietly. "He used it to teach me how to find my way home when the sky was unfamiliar." Rowan reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering uncertainly. "You may keep it here," Maris said, "or leave it in the library. You decide." He took it with both hands, his grip careful, reverent. He did not look at Cassian this time. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper. Maris rose smoothly. She did not touch him. She did not promise anything she could not keep. That evening, supper was served at the long table in the smaller hall. Rowan sat at one end, Cassian at the other. Maris took the seat between them, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Conversation was minimal. Rowan ate quietly, his attention drifting now and then to the satchel resting beside his chair. Cassian observed without comment, though his gaze lingered more than once on the boy. After the meal, Maris followed Mistress Halden through the household offices. She asked to see the storerooms, the ledgers, the schedules. There was resistance at first, subtle and habitual, but it faded as Maris moved with assurance rather than intrusion. By the time night settled over Greywatch, Maris stood at the window of her chamber, looking out at the dark sweep of land beyond the walls. The wind pressed against the glass, restless and alive. This place would test her. But for the first time in years, the test felt honest. The first sign of trouble did not arrive as a crisis, but as an inconsistency. Maris noticed it 3 mornings after her arrival, while reviewing the household ledgers brought to her chamber at her request. The pages were thick, the ink steady, the handwriting disciplined. At a glance, everything appeared in order. It was only when she began to trace the figures across weeks rather than days that the pattern revealed itself. Provisions were being ordered on schedule. Deliveries were logged without delay, yet the stores themselves did not reflect the volume recorded. She said nothing at first. Instead, she asked Mistress Halden for a full inventory, phrasing the request as routine rather than alarm. The woman hesitated, then complied. The results confirmed what Maris already suspected. Grain was missing, Not enough to provoke immediate scarcity, but enough to weaken the household before winter tightened its grip. Maris folded the inventory and set it aside. That afternoon she walked the storerooms herself. She did not accuse. She did not question. She observed the flow of movement, the placement of keys, the rhythm of the guards' patrols. She noted which doors creaked and which did not, which names appeared too often beside authorizations, and which never did at all. Cassian found her there just before dusk. "You should not be here alone," he said, his tone firm rather than alarmed. "I am not alone," Maris replied. "I am paying attention." He glanced at the shelves, the sealed barrels, the careful order. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," she said, "but not irreparably." She led him back toward the main corridor, her pace unhurried. Only once they were out of earshot did she speak again. "The loss is systematic," she said. "Small enough to avoid notice, steady enough to matter. Someone with authority is diverting provisions and masking it through proper channels." Cassian's jaw tightened. "You're certain?" "I am," Maris replied. "And if we confront it openly now, whoever is responsible will disappear with the rest." Cassian considered her words. He was accustomed to decisive action, to confronting threats directly. This required patience. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Maris met his gaze. "We let them believe they are unseen." Over the next 2 days she altered nothing that could be traced to her. Orders went out as usual. Deliveries continued. But quietly she began to change the structure beneath the surface. She introduced a second seal for authorization, rotated guard shifts without announcement, and reassigned record-keeping duties under the guise of efficiency. She also spoke to Rowan, not about the missing grain, about maps. They sat together in the library in the early evenings, the great windows darkened by nightfall. Rowan traced routes with careful fingers, asking questions that revealed a sharp, curious mind. Maris answered when she could and admitted when she did not. She never spoke down to him. She never hurried him. "Why do people hide things?" Rowan asked one night, not looking up from the chart. "Sometimes," Maris said, "because they think what they want matters more than what they owe." Rowan frowned. "That's not fair." "No," she agreed, "but it is common." The following morning, Maris requested a meeting with the household officers. She did not accuse anyone. She praised the order of the estate, then announced a restructuring of oversight, citing preparation for winter. New procedures were introduced, clear and unavoidable. The room shifted subtly as those present realized that anonymity was ending. By nightfall, the culprit revealed himself without being named. The quartermaster failed to appear for his shift. By morning, he was gone. Cassian reviewed the final reports in silence. "You resolved this without spectacle," he said, "without force." "Force would have punished the symptom," Maris replied. "Structure corrects the cause." He studied her, seeing not just competence, but foresight. "You did not wait for permission." "You gave it to me," she said evenly, "when you asked what I suggested." Cassian nodded once. It was not praise, but it carried weight. That evening, Rowan joined them at supper without prompting. He spoke little, but when he did, Cassian listened. Maris noticed the change not as a sudden warmth, but as a loosening, a household shifting its balance. Later, as Maris returned to her chamber, she realized something quietly profound. She had not been tested here because she was doubted. She had been tested because the place required strength, and she had answered. Winter announced itself without ceremony. The days shortened, the light thinning to a pale presence that lingered briefly before retreating behind stone and cloud. Greywatch adapted as it always had, tightening its routines, sealing its stores, preparing for endurance rather than comfort. Maris moved through the changes with growing familiarity, her authority no longer tentative, her decisions anticipated rather than questioned. Rowan began to wait for her in the library. It was never stated as an arrangement. He simply appeared there in the evenings, seated at the long table with his chart spread carefully before him, his small hands ink-smudged from copying constellations by memory. When Maris entered, he did not look up at once, but he shifted slightly, making room as though he had always expected her to join him. She did. They spoke of stars first, then of roots, then of nothing in particular. Maris listened more than she instructed. When Rowan asked a question, she answered directly. When she did not know, she said so without apology. He seemed to trust her more for it. One night, As the wind pressed hard against the windows, Rowan traced a path across the map and stopped. "This one doesn't work," he said. "Why not?" Maris asked. "It looks shorter," he replied, but the ground is wrong. You'd lose time fixing what breaks." Maris smiled faintly. "That's a good way to see it." Rowan considered her for a moment. "You do that too." "Do what?" "Choose the longer way so things don't fall apart later." She did not answer at once. She only nodded because he was right, and because hearing it spoken aloud felt unexpectedly grounding. Cassian observed these moments from a distance at first. He did not intrude, but he did not ignore them either. He began to alter his own routines, arriving earlier to supper, remaining longer in the common rooms. The household adjusted subtly around him as though responding to a shift in weather, rather than command. One evening, as Maris reviewed winter supply projections in the smaller hall, Cassian approached with a bundle of papers in hand. He set them down beside her without comment. "These arrived today," he said. "Trade estimates from the eastern route." Maris scanned them quickly, her brow furrowing. "The margins are narrower than last year." "Yes. The cost of repair has been underestimated," she said. "If we proceed as planned, we'll absorb the loss." Cassian watched her work through the figures. "What would you change?" She adjusted the schedule, recalculated the sequence of deliveries, and circled 2 entries. "Delay this shipment by a fortnight. Advance the northern exchange. The roads will hold longer than they appear and will gain leverage before demand rises." Cassian considered it. "That would shift risk to the merchants." "It would distribute it," Maris corrected. "They profit from our stability. It's reasonable." He nodded slowly. "Do it." The ease with which he deferred did not go unnoticed by either of them. It was not submission. It was trust. Later that night, Cassian found Rowan in the corridor outside the library, standing uncertainly with his chart clutched to his chest. "You're still awake," Cassian said. Rowan stiffened, then relaxed when he saw no displeasure. "I was going to put this away." Cassian glanced at the parchment. "You've been studying." "Yes." A pause followed. Cassian was not accustomed to filling such spaces gently, but he did not turn away. "She teaches well," he said. Rowan looked up, surprised. "She listens?" Cassian inclined his head. "That matters." They walked together the length of the corridor, their steps uneven but aligned. It was the first time Cassian did not send the boy ahead or leave him behind. The shift was subtle, but it carried weight. As the weeks passed, Greywatch changed in ways no ledger could capture. Meals grew marginally longer. Conversations, once purely functional, gained pauses where questions might be asked and answered. Rowan began to speak at the table without being prompted, his voice steadier each time. One evening, as Maris prepared to leave the hall, Cassian stopped her. "You've altered the household," he said. She met his gaze. "It was already changing." "Because of you," he corrected. Maris considered that. "Because you allowed it." He studied her. Something unreadable in his expression. "I allowed efficiency. You allowed presence," she replied. For a moment neither spoke. Cassian broke the silence first. "Greywatch has never been a home." "It can be," Maris said quietly, "if it's permitted to be more than a fortress." Cassian did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was lower. "I don't know how to build that." "You don't have to," Maris replied. You only have to stop preventing it." Something eased then, not dramatically but decisively. That night, as Maris prepared to retire, she found a small parcel placed neatly on her desk. Inside lay a compass, its casing worn but well cared for, its needle steady. There was no note. She did not need one. Holding it, Maris felt the strange certainty that something essential had crossed an invisible threshold. What had begun as alignment was becoming something else, still restrained, still unspoken, but undeniably present. Greywatch remained cold. The wind still howled against stone. But within its walls, a shape was forming. Valeborn received them with the same polished indifference it always had. The city looked unchanged as their carriage passed through its gates. Streets swept clean, facades restored, the air thick with familiarity. Yet to Maris, everything felt subtly misaligned, as though she were viewing a carefully preserved portrait of a place she no longer belonged to. They had not returned for display. Cassian had made that clear from the outset. A collection of land charters tied to Ashfell's eastern boundary was being auctioned at Ashmere Hall, their ownership disputed after years of neglect. If acquired by the wrong hands, the documents could fracture legal authority across several holdings. Cassian intended to secure them, swiftly and without complication. Maris understood the significance immediately. These were not sentimental relics. They were leverage. Ashmere Hall buzzed with restrained anticipation on the evening of the auction. The crowd was dense, composed of those who valued advantage above artistry. Maris entered beside Cassian, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. She did not seek out familiar faces. She let them find her. They did. Whispers followed in their wake, muted but unmistakable. Some carried curiosity, others disbelief. A few carried satisfaction sharpened by long memory. Maris noted them without reaction, her attention fixed forward. Rowan walked between them, his small hand resting lightly against Maris's sleeve. He had insisted on attending, his voice steady but resolute. Maris had not dismissed him. Cassian had not forbidden it. They took their seats as the hall settled. The bidding began without delay. Documents changed hands in silence, broken only by raised paddles and murmured figures. Maris tracked each movement carefully, her mind mapping alliances, calculating thresholds. She leaned toward Cassian once, spoke quietly, and he adjusted his bid accordingly. It did not go unnoticed. Halfway through the proceedings, a familiar voice cut across the subdued murmur. "Well," Dorian Hale said lightly, turning in his seat to face them. "Valborn grows more surprising by the year." Maris met his gaze without flinching. "Duke Varric," Dorian continued, inclining his head. "And Duchess, of course. I hardly recognized you." "I would imagine not," Maris replied calmly. Dorian's smile tightened. "The North suits you. It lends presence." She did not respond to the implication. She did not need to. His gaze flicked downward briefly toward Rowan. Something calculated settled behind his eyes. "And this must be the young charge," he said. "I've heard Ashfell has acquired more than land these days." The words were chosen carefully. The cruelty was not. Maris felt Rowan stiffen beside her. "This is Rowan," she said evenly. "He is with us." Dorian's brows lifted in mock apology. "Of course, forgive my curiosity. Rumors travel faster than carriages." Before Maris could reply, the auctioneer called for the next bid. Cassian raised his paddle without looking away from Dorian. "Be cautious," Dorian murmured. "Valborn is less forgiving than your fortress." Cassian turned then, his gaze cold and level. "Ashfell does not require forgiveness." The exchange ended there, but its echo lingered. As the evening progressed, Maris sensed the shift. Conversations angled toward Rowan with unnatural interest. Glances lingered. Questions were asked indirectly, then less so. The rumor Dorian had planted began to breathe. Rowan's grip on Maris's sleeve tightened. She did not soothe him with false reassurance. She did not whisper for patience. She waited. The moment came when one woman, emboldened by wine and proximity, leaned too close. "It must be difficult," she said softly, "to manage such a household with uncertainties." Maris looked at her fully. "Uncertainty is manageable," she replied. "Cruelty is not." The woman flushed and withdrew, but the damage was already done. Eyes had turned. The hall's attention sharpened. Rowan's breathing quickened. He looked up at Maris, his expression a mixture of fear and resolve. She stood. The movement drew silence more effectively than any raised voice. "This hall is devoted to ownership," Maris said, her tone calm but unyielding. "So let us be clear. Rowan is under my protection, not quietly, not conditionally." A ripple passed through the crowd. Cassian rose beside her, his presence anchoring but restrained. He did not speak yet. Dorian smiled thinly. "Protection is generous," he said. "Legitimacy, however, is another matter." Maris turned to face him fully. "You once accused me of being too much," she said, her voice steady. Too visible, too capable, too present. Tonight you mistake that for vulnerability again. The room held its breath. I am not embarrassed by this child, she continued. I am honored to stand with him. Rowan looked up at her, stunned. Cassian stepped forward then, his voice cutting through the tension with practiced precision. The matter of Rowan's status has already been resolved, he said. Legally and irrevocably. He produced a document from within his coat, holding it where the light could not obscure it. Guardianship has been formally established. Any attempt to undermine it will be considered interference with Ashfell's authority. The silence that followed was absolute. Dorian's smile faltered. You would go that far? Cassian's gaze did not waver. I already have. Maris looked down at Rowan and placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and public. You belong, she said quietly. No one here gets to question that. Rowan straightened. The auction resumed, subdued and cautious. Bidding concluded swiftly after that. Cassian secured the final document without challenge. As they departed Ashmere Hall, Maris felt the weight of Valeborn lift from her shoulders, not because she had defeated it, but because she no longer sought its permission. Behind them, Dorian Hale sat very still, his carefully maintained confidence fractured by the realization that the world he relied upon no longer centered him. They left Valeborn at dawn. The city did not protest their departure. It rarely did. It simply closed behind them, its judgments already turning toward new subjects. Maris watched the streets pass from the carriage window with a sense of finality that did not require ceremony. What had bound her there had been loosened long before this journey back, and now it released her entirely. Rowan sat quietly beside her, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap. He did not cling. He did not retreat. Whatever fear had once hollowed his posture had been replaced by something steadier, something earned. Cassian rode opposite them, his presence contained, deliberate. He had spoken little since the auction, but silence from him did not signal distance. It signaled completion. The road north stretched long and open. Snow gathered along its edges, thin at first, then deeper as the land rose and the air sharpened. When Greywatch finally appeared against the pale horizon, Maris felt the subtle relief of return, not to safety, but to continuity. The gates opened as they approached. Inside, the household moved with familiar purpose. But there was a difference now. Small, almost imperceptible. Heads lifted more readily. Pauses lengthened. Eyes followed Rowan, not with avoidance, but acknowledgement. At supper that evening, Maris did not take her usual seat between Cassian and Rowan. She sat beside Rowan instead. No announcement accompanied the choice. No explanation followed it. The table adjusted around her without protest, as though the arrangement had always been waiting to be recognized. Later, when the household had settled and the corridors quieted, Rowan stood hesitantly in the doorway of the smaller hall where Maris reviewed correspondence. May I stay here? He asked. She looked up. You don't need permission. He considered that, then nodded and took a seat near the fire, unfolding his chart with careful hands. Cassian entered a short while later. He observed the scene without comment, then crossed to the table and set down a sealed packet. It's done, he said. Maris did not ask what he meant. She already knew. The documents within formalized what had been declared publicly, Rowan's place within Ashfell, protected not by secrecy, but by law. Guardianship, inheritance provisions, language precise enough to withstand challenge. Maris closed the packet gently. That was not easy, she said. Cassian's expression was unreadable. Neither is allowing cruelty to persist. She met his gaze, understanding the cost of that decision for him, not in power, but in habit. Thank you. He inclined his head. It was necessary. That night the wind rose, pressing against the walls of Greywatch with familiar insistence. Maris stood at the window of her chamber, the compass Cassian had given her resting in her palm. Its needle held steady despite the storm. Cassian joined her without announcement. You did not hesitate, he said quietly. In Valeborn. I hesitated for years, Maris replied. Just not in that moment. He considered her profile, the certainty she no longer disguised. You claimed him. Yes, she said. Because no one should learn to survive by becoming invisible. Cassian was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice lower, unadorned. I have spent my life building walls. You walked in and taught them to hold without closing. Maris turned to face him. You allowed it. He nodded once. I did. The space between them did not close with urgency. It narrowed with intention. I do not offer poetry, Cassian said. I offer what I am. Maris did not smile. She did not soften the truth for comfort. Then offer it honestly. He met her gaze fully. I love you. The words were not dramatic. They were precise. Maris felt them settle, not as a rush, but as alignment finally named. I know, she said. I have watched you choose us. That was enough. Years later, Greywatch was no longer spoken of solely as a fortress. It was known as a place that endured, not because it resisted change, but because it integrated it. Rowan grew into his curiosity without fear, his questions sharpened rather than silenced. He learned the stars, the land, and the responsibility that came with belonging. Maris governed without apology. Her presence was not decorative, it was structural. When she wrote to her daughter one winter evening, her words were simple. Do not make yourself smaller to fit rooms that were never built for you. Build your own, and let them stand. The wind howled beyond the walls, but within them Greywatch held, not as a fortress alone, as a home.